So let us return to the topic of preschool age or early childhood physical development and cognitive development. This is lecture 2 on this topic. So I noted in between lectures that your lecture outline and my intention is to briefly discuss the immunizations that occur during this particular stage of life, but that's not mentioned in your textbook. So I just want to sort of draw your attention to this chart here, and if any of you have small children, you've seen this chart, but it outlines all of the different immunizations that occur. And so the discussion post that I had intended to go with this is, what are some of the arguments both for and against? And this is kind of a hot political topic right now, especially as we're talking even about a COVID vaccine. And so I've just asked you to think about, what is your attitude? Because there are some subcultures and some folks with political philosophies or religious philosophies that resist the universally required immunizations as part of like gaining access to the public schools. And it is true that over the course of certainly the last 50 years, the number of immunizations that children are required to have has continued to grow and to grow and to grow. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, my father had polio when he was small. I think he was like two or 3 years old, and the polio vaccine was not available at the time, and certainly it was killing a lot of people. And then, you come into a period where when my daughter, who's now 20, was sent to school, she was expected to have the chickenpox vaccine. Chickenpox, where polio killed people, chickenpox doesn't kill people. And there's some folks that really resisted that as well. Like they understood it for like polio, but chickenpox. And now there is a Gardasil vaccine, which is for a sexually transmitted infection that can potentially, if it goes untreated, treat cancer. And first it was required for only girls, and now it's starting to be required for boys. And so there is some resistance to all of the more and more vaccines, as opposed to those that were just sort of I actually would have to go back and do my own sort of research. So I'm really just curious as to what your position on vaccines is, and I'll make sure I put my thoughts in that discussion too. And hopefully you've noticed by now that on those discussion posts, you have to post your comments before you get to read other people's. All right, so that's not actually discussed in your textbook, but the things that are discussed is the phenomena of childhood obesity. And so obesity is kind of, it's a curious phenomena, because obesity is not a phenomena in poor countries. It is a phenomena only in wealthy, privileged countries. So poor people like Sudan doesn't have obesity epidemic. Uganda doesn't have an obesity epidemic because they barely have enough money to feed their people. But in wealthy countries like our own, obesity is correlated with poor people. So poor people are more likely. So it is a condition of poor people in rich countries, right? There is a pretty strong social class having to do with, and then there's things called food deserts, where families live where there's really no grocery stores, and people get the bulk of their groceries from convenience stores, and it's highly processed, and it's got all these chemicals so it can sit on the shelf for a long time. There's no produce. And there has been, at least in my community that I'm aware of in the state of Kansas, there has been an effort to help low-income people gain access to things like farmers markets. If you go to a farmers market, the food there is way more expensive. It's way more expensive to get fresh vegetables than it is to get canned vegetables. And you can get canned vegetables at free food banks, but you can't get fresh, farm produced, clean. What I mean by clean is without chemicals like pesticides and stuff. So it's more expensive. So what that means is privileged people have more access to clean, what we call whole foods, and more processed, more salt, more fat is cheaper. And so low income people, there also seems to be kind of a genetic component with obesity, and and an environmental component. In other words, when the people around you are overweight, you're more likely to be overweight too. right? And people are just getting fatter, especially in the United States. We are some of the fattest people on the planet. And unfortunately, obesity continues to be the last acceptable form of social discrimination. It is completely legal in our culture to fire someone for being for being overweight, not hire someone on the grounds that they're overweight, charge them more for goods and services that you don't charge for other people, and there's a profound stigma attached to obesity. So I have a real, oh, what's the word, empathy for people that struggle with weight. My mother has always been large, and I've watched people be very, very judgmental of her. Anyway, but I'll just sort of leave that there, that children are showing signs of obesity earlier and earlier. One of the preventative methods, or thought to be a preventative methods, is actually breastfeeding. That breastfeeding babies are less likely to be obese than bottle-fed babies. Another thing that's discussed in your textbook is food allergies. There is an increasing number of food allergies. We could talk about some of the theories as to why people have more food allergies. One could be people are simply more aware of food allergies. The theory that I think kind of makes a little bit of sense is that our environments are too clean, because what an allergy is it is the body's immune system fighting something that it doesn't need to fight. So allergies are a form of an autoimmune disorder. And some theorists argue that because especially now, because we're washing our hands all the time, because we don't play in the dirt that's got microbes, because our environments are just so germ free, that our bodies have begun to kind of attack themselves, right? And I've read some pretty interesting stuff that talks about how it's based on the concept of exposure therapy, that children who are given, so peanut allergies are supposed to be one of the more common ones, but children who are exposed to very small amounts of peanuts at an early stage, at an early stage of their life, are less likely to develop peanut allergies. But it's again the idea that our environment doesn't give us opportunities to develop normal immune responses. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so there's a discussion about accidents. The most common cause of accidents or death for children between 3 and 6 is accidents in their own house, right, in their own home. Some of this may be by the nature of a toddler. If you've ever had a toddler around, you know they try to get into everything. They try to climb everything. You just can't turn your back on them for a minute. My mom likes to tell the story when I was eating polish or something. I don't know, she'd been mopping the floor, and I picked up the bottle of floor wax and drank the floor wax, which just turned out to be soap. And then there's the story of, having turned around and I'd laid my hand down on the lawnmower, right? So this is just kind of the nature of what toddlers do. I mean, one of the things that we talked about their cognitive development is they're really learning about where they're really exploring the world. And so good, I hate to say that word, but not good parent, but so if we really want to maximize a child's growth and well-being, we create an environment where they are free to explore and free to explore safely, so that they don't put themselves at risk, but at the same time, you don't just want to put them in a box to keep them safe, because then all those neural connections aren't happening. Okay, there's a discussion about poisoning, right, about environmental poisoning. Of course, there was a big deal for a period about lead in households, and poisoning is another one of those things. We happen to see more of it in low-income people. And part of that, especially the lead poisoning, well, you think about what's happening up in Detroit, right, with all of isn't that Detroit? Up in, yeah, I want to say it's up in Detroit, with the lead pipes, with all the pipes and all the pollution that's getting into the water. And of course, people that have economic means can move to another city. They can get out of there. They can buy bottled water. People that don't have economic means must use the water that's coming out of their pipes. We have stories about old houses. Often old houses are cheap. Their rent is cheap because they're run down. They may be painted with lead paint, and children may, touch the windowsills, or they may actually put their mouths on I think that was the one I remember reading about, is that kids would like put their mouths on the windowsills. And then so in some cases you have to sign a voucher, you have to sign a waiver if you're moving into an old home, saying that you know it's got lead paint, or in some cases that the homeowner says it doesn't have lead paint, right? And then there's also something called it's called environmental racism. And it can be environmental racism, environmental justice, but that's the idea that places where there are a lot of chemicals, a lot of pesticides, where the water is unclean, there are more pollutants, right? Where there's more, say, I just think of my own experience when I was quite poor and I was a young mother. We lived in a part of Wichita that had a lot of air pollution because it was right next to the Vulcan chemical plant, right? Privileged people don't live there. Privileged people live farther away, but poor people often live closer to heavy manufacturing and pollutants. Okay, so that's the end of that. That's the end of that particular topic here. Yeah, so social class. So one of the variables that we'll actually continue to talk about is the variable of social class. And I think I'm going to stop right here. And in fact, when I come back, then I'll start talking about cognitive development.